Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this panel on science and politics. My name is Antonio Loprieno, and I'm an Egyptologist by training, so a humanist, but acting as president of ALLEA, the Organization of European Academies of Science and Humanities, co-organizer of this event. The section we will be attending this afternoon is dedicated, as I said, to science and politics. And this is a very general topic within the broader perspective of science communication, which, as you know, is at the center of our attention in this conference. Now, the subtitle, as you will have certainly seen, is finding a balanced relationship for society, a balanced relationship between these two communities, the community of scientists and the political, particularly the policy-making world. So what we will be concerned with in this dialogue, which will take us until 2:45, so a little bit like an hour and 15 minutes, is how does this dialogue between science and politics work? Does it work at all? How to mediate between very different interests and very different also conditions of science and political decisions on the other hand, how to persuade politicians, but also how to get the message through to make sometimes clear that what is perceived as science is not necessarily unified by itself, but there are very many opinions that need to be also considered when conveying scientific opinion and scientific, generally speaking, scientific advice. In order to discuss this issue, we have gathered 4 really distinguished individuals, while all of them scientists, all of them also with a distinguished record of dialogue with the political world in all its aspects, with the decision-making sector at different levels. We have with us Professor Antje Boetius, who is the director of the Alfred Wegener Institute. It's an institute for marine studies and climate research in Bremerhaven, which is a city in northern Germany. We have Professor Janusz Bujnicki, right, from Warsaw. He's a cell biologist and professor of bioinformatics at the University of Potsdam, who has also served as advisor on the group of chief scientific advisors of the European Union. Professor Ortwin Renn is a sociologist and a sustainability researcher, actually director of an Institute of Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, and a risk researcher, a researcher of risk, not a risky researcher himself, we trust, right? And Dr. Bella Starling, who is the director of Wellcome, who actually is an organization that aims at bringing together people and health research at Manchester University within the Foundation Trust of the NHS of that university. So as you see, all individuals, colleagues that come from very different disciplinary areas. We have natural sciences represented by Professor Boetius. We have life sciences represented by Professor Bujnicki. We have social sciences by Professor Renn, and health sciences by Dr. Starling. So what we have thought at the beginning is perhaps to let them actually speak freely about how they respond to this somewhat so cryptic label, right? So science and politics, how to find a balanced relationship for society. Wow, there are really very many buzzwords all combined there. And so what is the first statement? And then we'll try all of them together to kind of challenge them. You know, in a first round, I will try to find any weak point that I may find in their argument. In the very unlikely case there is any, And then, of course, I would need your support with your questions and answers that I ask you also to write down in the section questions and answer. And that, so I'll try to convey to our panelists in the most appropriate manner. If that is okay for you, well, not that you have much choice now, so this is more of a rhetorical device, yet I would ask perhaps so our participants to give us a first insight into their feeling about this word, and then we move from there. So Antje, may I ask you to start?
Very well. Yeah, thank you, Antonio. And because you're an epidemiologist, I start with a Roman quote, and that is "Scientia potentia est." Knowledge is power. And that explains, and if one dives a little bit into the history of science and science-driven innovation, it is clear that there is no way to give a protected realm to science where it's not immediately in the focus of policy advice, of politics, of a key role in driving humanity, driving our so-called technosphere, but driving also the fundamental understanding of the Earth system, the planet we're on. I think everyone has become aware during the pandemic that at parts when we go into a crisis that is defined by the unknown, so dealing with something that is not known, that seems to be an alien that affects us all. And we have to find immediate urgent solutions in how we respond, what we do, and how we beware us from a lot of losses, including life and death questions, that it is good to be able to have some scientists to ask, but it also feels awkward in democracies to rely on a few people who are there in time and space to advise politics, and that everything changes and lies on the shoulder of a few giants. Hence, in Germany, we had a huge debate. We still have. We have media campaigns. We have ongoing discussions. And I just come from one 2 days ago. Our Ministry for Research and Education published together with 150 science communicators, including the heads of science organizations, but also very practical people, also journalists and representatives of the media, a paper that is basically a work in progress paper. We call the process factory Wellcome, so factory science communication, where several hypotheses and work agendas for science and politics have been accumulated, also the media. How do we ensure science communication of political, societal relevance, but at the highest quality, so that it doesn't harm science, but that it supports and drives science and the longing for so many people, including the young generation of scientists who have this dilemma in their careers. Can I spare time? Can I afford visibility in the hot themes out there in society? Can I put myself into the limelight and do something good in that I share my perspective, my knowledge with society, that I incorporate questions of society by going into a dialogue and by working with others to synthesize scientific knowledge. And from that process, we now have this paper. It's the biggest paper, the biggest process that has ever occurred, where such many ideas come together. It was quite a fight also, because the idea that ministries, journalists, and heads of science organizations define together what is good politics advice, what is good, a good relationship, a healthy relationship between science and politics cannot be concluded with one voice. The dangers that have been seen are, however, smaller than the chances that we're all aware of. The future that is, from my perspective of an Earth system scientist, a beginning of increasing crisis, because we have run out of natural and healthy balance with the way we deal with Earth and humanity. The future depends on a togetherness of scientific thinking, scientific process, scientific values that include the inclusion of a diversity, an openness, a reliability in the methods, a trust in methods that practically no other sector of society owns that much as science does. That is, for some that may listen, a weird and awkward statement that I make here, but when I compare other cultural sectors and when we use the questionnaires or the polls we've had with Science and Dialogue, it shows the same result. When people think, they do not put their backs to science, they give science the highest rating for trust in institutions and cultures, and that goes long before we come to politics or the media or even the police or other important institutions in our government. And how can we perform as scientists? And I'll end here. As scientists, we need to understand that scienza potentia est, that it is part of the knowledge per se, that it is seen by the context in society as a power. We cannot drive that much further without thinking inclusion, without thinking participation. We need to be trained as scientists, and we need a lot of support. It needs to be realized by society and by politics that we have a special culture, a special method, and that we can use for the role we are given by society and the trust we're given by society. We need more support, more teaching, more education, and the willingness to go into conflict, and the willingness to support a couple of people that stand out in, with their insight, with their systematic thinking, with their geniality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antje. We shall certainly come back to this so interaction and dialectic between, trusting a selected group of people and inclusion and participation. Thank you very much. Janusz, now you are the voice of the European Union. No, not really, but you were at one time. So please.
Thank you very much, Antonio, for giving me the opportunity to share my perspective. And I would like to share perspective not just from what I learned while being one of the chief scientific advisors for the European Commission, but also in my various other advisory roles, also for the Polish government. And there are many ways how science and policy interact, and even more ways for politicians and scientists to interact. There is science diplomacy. There are scientists studying how politics is done, and how what are the rules of policy making, what is the history of policy making, and so on. I'm not going to dwell on this. There are two important elements of where advice comes in, is science for policy advice and policy for science advice. And I have some experience in both roles. Today, I will focus mostly on science for policy advice, where scientists translate knowledge into messages for policymakers, how to make better public policies. And here, I would like to start by saying that in general, it is more important what people believe is true than what is actually true. And what exists in the head exists. And science advice is to give proper importance of what is actually true, and not only what is believed to be true. But is it possible? So first, scientific advice can only translate into results in public policies if there's real interest, real appetite on the part of decision makers. And many decision makers have no appetite for scientific knowledge at all, because knowledge of other areas is sufficient for them. And in democracy, voter preferences are far more important than knowledge. For some politicians, however, interest in the usefulness of the scientific knowledge can be generated. This appetite can be motivated, stimulated through interaction with voters and other stakeholders. And second is that the scientific advisor opinions are never the basis of public policies. It's extremely rare that actually public policy making starts with scientific advice. And usually scientific advice is most useful as a complement on issues where knowledge of scientific data, among other factors, can help predict the consequences of policy decisions, especially to save the politicians from making a big mistake that will materialize very quickly. And scientists and scientific advisors in particular need to understand that there are many opinions at stake, and in particularly what is politically possible for the recipient of the advice, how other players will react in policy making, what people believe and what they can be persuaded to believe, what the message will be in the media, what are financial conditions, what is possible under the current legal order, and all these issues usually take precedence over what the science says. 3, advisory recommendations are useful and they can be actually used if they relate to very specific public policies or political decisions. And if they are specific and delivered on time, and the recommendations that are general and not directed at issues that are actually important right now for the policymaker, will usually not be used. Further, effective scientific advice requires the advisors to be credible and recognized in the eyes of all stakeholders, so policymakers, also other scientists, and the public. And the credibility and trust is built in a long time and can be very easily ruined. So scientific advice can be effective if it's delivered by experts with high authority, and ideally this advisor should also have authority among other scientists around the world, be publicly known and respected, and be independent thanks to this authority. In this context, it is very important that the role of a scientific advisor is not to present their own research results or to lobby for the results of other scientists or for science in general. Of course, such lobbying is important, but it should not be combined with science for policy advice. And in particular, active scientists who do research themselves should not combine science advice, science for policy advice, and advice for policy for science, especially regarding research funding. Because obviously the conducting research in the area of advice represents a conflict of interest and should be very openly declared and treated with care by decision makers. So this an advisory role also requires a very clear mandate and clear distinction between advice and decision making. And scientific advice has no chance of working properly without adequate operational and administrative support. So the easiest way to make an advisory body non-functional is to gather a number of scientists and give them one person of administrative assistance. It's a guarantee that this advice will be completely useless unless the purpose of this is to make scientists busy with something else than they would be doing otherwise. So administrative support for scientific advice is extremely important. And last but not least, regular and active contact between advisors and policymakers is essential, and without it, the science advice would never work. So with all these problems, is good science advice possible at all? On the upside, we scientists love sharing our view and giving advice to others. So advice should be possible because as scientists love to give advice to policymakers. But on the other hand, we scientists typically hate making simple explanations. We love giving advice to others on what they should or shouldn't do and not necessarily what they want to actually listen to. And we are not very good at listening to others. And of course, the most typical advice of a scientist is we need more research on this topic. And I have a question. So what trait do politicians know that connects scientists, compulsive gamblers, and exiled royalty? Everybody probably is thinking about the answer. So I don't have much time to wait or to gather answers, but one of the possible answers is that there's never enough money to satisfy the desires of these three kinds. And we must remember that the politicians know that. So just to finalize this opening statement, politicians know that the scientist's advice is often not really a scientific advice, and that an advising scientist is often just a person with their beliefs and interests who shares the view on TV or social media and not really a scientific advisor. Being a scientific advisor requires a very different approach to communicating science to policymakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janusz. So we now all know that at any rate, we should all get more money. And I think that will be probably the first result of our panel. Ortwin, may I now ask you perhaps to bring in the perspective of the social scientists also into this topic?
Well, thank you very much, Antonio. I thought the two speakers in front of me also were already very well trained in social sciences. So in that sense, I'm sure I can add something to it. And I would like to add the perspective of the recipient of scientific advice. So I would like to go into the role of the policymaker. And my question is, what does a policymaker need from scientists in order to make better decisions? And why is that so important? Well, we'll find out that policymakers have a lot of different needs. And I think it's always very important to distinguish between those needs and then to see what kind of policy advice or what kind of structure for policy advice is most appropriate for meeting this kind of specific request or demand. And I like to distinguish between 5 different types of needs. The first one is policymakers want to have enlightenment. Well, not all of them, but many do. They just want to know about the topic. They just want to know what is the discussion right now about topic X and Y. They just want to be informed. They just want to be literate about a topic. That is one of the nicest things for scientists because they can really talk about what they like most about their topic. And that's also important. I think, you have something like an evening talk or what we sometimes call the chimney talk, yeah, in which just politicians come in, small groups in which we just, introduce the topic and then you have questions about it. And there's no need for driving a specific policy out of this. It's just much more enlightenment. The second one is that's almost the opposite. That's instrumental knowledge. And that is politicians come up and say, we have 3 options here. We want to know what are the consequences of these 3 options. The ones, is it effective first? I mean, does it really do what it's supposed to do? But what kind of side effects do we expect from each of these options? So we have this in the energy field, for example. We want to be, climate neutral in 2045 in Germany. What kind of options do we have? And what are the pros and cons for each option? And that's much more difficult because then we need definitely interdisciplinary, but we also have to make sure that we understand the uncertainties that are associated with it and not oversell our knowledge. The third one, which is also a little bit related to it, but not totally, is strategic advice. And strategic advice basically means that politicians say, we have a specific goal, or we believe that that is what we would like to accomplish, but we don't know the strategy to reach it. And now that as scientists, how can we reach it? And so it's not that the options are already given, but that scientists are actually trying to develop or design options. So we could take the same example and say, well, we have no idea how we can reach to be climate neutral, for example, in the air traffic or in a large transportation of big trucks or big ships. Maybe something that Antje wants to know more about it too. I have much more knowledge about that. And then we ask, what are the strategies there? Is it synthetic fuel? Is it something totally different? And so in that sense, this kind of strategic advice is sometimes very important. The fourth one is monitoring. And I think that's sometimes, I think seen as not so important, but I think it's one of the most important things. The world has become much more complex, and things that look very effective in the first place may be very ineffective because of a lot of complex things that we even don't have a good knowledge about, where we do have a lot of uncertainty. And then, if we don't monitor, we continue doing things that are probably very counterproductive. And I think, if we had more monitoring commissions that look into them, into a success of things that nobody knows in advance about, how effective they are or how productive they are, that's an important element. And scientists very often are very good in monitoring. And so ex post, they can understand why things wouldn't work or can work. Ex ante, that's sometimes much more difficult. And I think those monitoring commissions would be really important in many things, like the pandemics that we go into and said, what did we learn from the pandemic? That we monitor what has gone wrong. So what we can learn from the past in order to be better prepared for the future. And the last one that is also the most ambitious one of the things which I think is also very important, what we call co-creative. And I think, again, both Antje and Janusz, you both alluded to that. That is that politicians and scientists and other groups, maybe stakeholders or people who are involved in it, sit together and saying, first, what is our problem? They all know that something is wrong, but we don't really know how to frame the problem. Or what is the situation right now and where do we want to go? So it's also, what is the kind of goal that we're looking at? And that is a little bit more difficult to do, I think, in terms of the discourse that's needed for that. But it's also very often needed in very complex situations in which we have what we sometimes call wicked problems, which we don't exactly know what the problem is. It depends very much on the frame, what, how we design and how we structure and how we imagine the problem. We may need to even create narratives around it. And this kind of co-creative methods are, as I said, very ambitious or difficult to do. And so my last point is, for the first one, alignment, it's good to have kind of a room, a space for politicians and scientists just to meet, not with a major agenda. For the second point, instrumental knowledge, it's very good to have the people who have knowledge about the options that are out there. That has to be interdisciplinary. And then very often commissions are fairly good, commissions on a specific topic that can say, well, this is probably the side effect of option A, B, and C. For the strategy thing, because maybe the options are not out there, very important is that the timing is extremely important. Science is slow. Politics also need fast answers. So we need to make sure that things are being anticipated early enough so that science has time to develop those options. If somebody calls me up, and that sometimes happens, and the party said, I don't know what to do, I have this problem, and need the solution tomorrow morning at 9, well, scientists cannot deliver unless they have it in the, somewhere in the desk. For monitoring, it's very important that the mandate is clear and that is very independent. Nobody wants to have a clapping applause clap for politics, but they have to be critical, and they have to get the freedom to be critical. That, I think, is extremely important. In some instances, we know that scientists have been selected, which are very much in favor of the present government, and then all they say, well, that was so great, even if there was no evidence. Then it doesn't help. So it's really to have this self-critical attitude. And for the last point, co-creation, which I said is the most ambitious, but also one that is really needed. What do we need is new kind of creative methods, which are, a part of a more deliberative type of democracy in which we have, a very good discourse between scientists and policymakers. Also, we need space for this. We need some time for this, but we also have to include other stakeholders, other knowledge holders, better than stakeholders, other knowledge holders that are part of this. And that, it's very important that we have very good designers of this communication. Our institute, for example, is one of those that try to design these kind of platforms that help us to come, to very productive in time with the co-creative methods. So these are the four things that five functions that I see from a policy perspective, and specifically from a perspective of a policymaker. And my main point is we have to design the process according to the function that needs to be served. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ortwin, for this. So what in Swiss German we call Auslegeordnung, which is a representation of everything that actually can be covered in this very broad topic. I'm very sure we shall come back to your very filigrane distinction in the minutes to come. Now, Bella, you bring in a dimension from health sciences, and God knows if there is one emotional field of science, this is probably health. So we are very interested in knowing your take on it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Antonio, and thanks to the previous panelists for some wonderful provocations and insights, and thank you for having me at this conference. So as you say, my comments and my input is in the context of health sciences based in the UK, in England, and I limit my contribution to that. So in answering the question, how do you perceive the relationship between science and politics? So science and politics have been guests in people's homes for the last year and beyond. And it's clear, and many science communication scholars have argued this much better than I can, that in fact science is not politically neutral, and some of the speakers have already referred to this. And this is not, this is not a new concept. And I would argue, though, that because science is not politically neutral, can science communication be politically neutral? This is something that we might want to discuss. But what might be emerging from COVID, and my experiences in the UK, is just how closely intertwined politics and science, and politicians and scientists are. And in this relationship, should we be conceptualizing of science communication as a form, perhaps, of political activism? So I don't often quote Margaret Thatcher, but she famously said that advisors advise and ministers decide. And this has been a line that has really been stuck to by both scientists and politicians in England. So the Scientific Advisory Group on Epidemics and its many subcommittees provide evidence and analysis. Scientists are providing impartial science advice. My provocation is really, how has SAGE been constructed? What are the values that have underpinned appointments? Is there a hierarchy within these advisory functions of evidence? Is quantitative evidence more valued than qualitative evidence? Whereas the evidence from social sciences, arts and humanities, and very importantly, from my perspective, working very much with patients and with citizens, where is the evidence from lived experience? And also, is there science communication expertise on these committees? There's another example in England of independent SAGE that was constructed in response to SAGE. Now, this is like a shadow committee, and it's overtly opinionated, I would say, but it is also based on science and evidence. So how does one committee, have a license for opinion and another committee not? And we also see, kind of more informal relationships between, and more unsaid relationships between politics and science. You can see sometimes in science advisors, in press briefings, visible discomfort when there's association with, when their advice might be commodified to illustrate certain policies that they might not agree with. And politicians, are they really being driven by data, not dates? How can politicians be divorced from the ideological and social contexts that got them elected into parliament in the first place, and upon which they have a mandate to act? And, really importantly for me is, where is the citizen science? Where is the public and patient insight and advocacy that, for example, has brought long COVID to attention? Long COVID would not be a thing, arguably, without that citizen and patient advocacy. And, that advocacy, that expertise by experience can help inform research and political priorities, as I think a previous speaker, Ortwin, was alluding to, and I would fully agree with this. So I guess my provocation is that it's impossible for science communication to remain politically neutral in this context. What does activism look like? I mean, it might be relatively non-controversial. So the form of activism that promotes evidence-based policymaking, that is perhaps a form of activism. We have the cult of scientific heroes. We have Chris Whitty merchandise in the UK now. We can drink out of Chris Whitty mugs and all that kind of thing. And there are examples of more overt activism. So, the science communication community, I think, has really rallied around issues of inequality and COVID and social justice, and has really kind of addressed some of the unhelpful and stigmatizing narratives around numbers, inequalities, and COVID. Face masks is another example, a very kind of binary scientist and politician debate, when actually science communication could have rallied around this to raise awareness, to gather, kind of insights and input from citizens around this. So, and in all this, there are familiar calls for increased trust. We need to trust science more, and these have been around for a long time. And I would argue that, science and politics need to prove themselves trustworthy, inclusive, and change their behaviors based on what we've been experiencing in the last year to 18 months. So I'll just close perhaps with another provocation, as if you haven't had enough already. You know, some of these arguments are not new. Some of them, you know, we might be taking a different lens on. But maybe we should be taking a counterfactual argument to refresh our thinking about these things. And maybe we should be asking ourselves is, what would a truly terrible relationship between science, politics, and people look like? Is there any of that happening now? How would we destroy a good relationship between science and politics? And as a science communication community, how can we make strategic, joined up and purposeful science communication to not let that happen? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Bella. Actually, just to reassure you, we even on the European continent, we can take some provocation. So you were not as provocative as you might have thought at all, quite to the contrary. No, now without jokes, you know, I think that I really thank you very much for the 4 presentations that in many respects didn't really overlap, but completed an overall general picture. And there is one aspect that I think emerged in all of them that perhaps in your contribution, Bella, has been so thematized in the most explicit way, but that was inherent in all so the other colleagues' presentation. And that is the relationship between the advice and the political decision. The very interesting motto by Margaret Thatcher that you mentioned is interesting in that respect, because in my opinion, it also betrays, as it were, a very different understanding of societal organization. And this is the question I would like to ask you, whether we are not talking of rather different things when we talk about science and politics, depending on the cultural tradition in which we operate. And broadly speaking, we could say that there are, so there are very many, but there are 2 traditions that have emerged, I would say, even in US speakers. There's the tradition of the Enlightenment of the German idealist type, where basically there's an expectation of improvement that comes from the political elite, and you know the higher standing of scientists is part of this German, let's call it German Enlightenment. And it's very different from the Scottish or English Enlightenment, which is an enlightenment of the invisible hand, which is an enlightenment in which actually it is the interaction between the stakeholders of society that creates the best possible society, not the top-down organization. So what I would like you to perhaps to address is, from your different perspective, can we really think of a science advice well described and well also realized, as you all do in your all 4 different ways, but let's say outside the political and, let me call it, philosophical way in which the common good is viewed within a particular society. And generally speaking, in continental Europe, there's a tendency to expect the common good to come somehow in a pyramidal way. And generally speaking, in the British world, there is less of an expectation of this kind of so it's more understandable that Margaret Thatcher said this. Probably the German chancellor, apart from her different political opinions, so Angela Merkel would never say this in this explicit way, let's say, for a variety of reasons. So how do you react to this interaction that so Ortwin also really described in a very precise scholarly way the 5 dimensions? Yes, Antje.
I would like to add one that I'm thinking a lot about, because I find it amazing. It also has to do with access and enablement, empowerment. And so when you think some of the questions, like in climate change and in the idea of planetary boundaries and the changes out there, so slowly, and often it is not even listed under the policy advice team, we have managed as international scientists, and it's truly international, to basically have a radar, a monitor, and some call it even more poetically a voice of Earth, because we have totally neutral scientific data about the situation on Earth, data. So data that are produced about CO2 in the atmosphere, about the emissions that are forwarded by nations. We have so many data sets about ourselves because we are, as humans, sharing data all the time. And there are scientists and scientific procedure behind all of them, and they allow an open monitor about the promises that politics provide to the future of society. And so that is completely new. That has never been that way, that without even having to trust so much into a nation or something in specific, you have a scientific culture of international collaboration and open sharing with the highest standards that allows at least those people with a mobile phone, and this is the majority of our people today. I mean, more people have access to mobile phone than to clear drinking water, but there is a way of measuring how political goals are realized. And this is a completely new thing, I would say, and I would like to add this activity of scientists to the list of this neutral policy advice that you've just described.
So Ortwin, yes, as a social scientist, so we are all waiting for you to tell us that neutral advice doesn't exist, actually.
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, the interesting thing is, I mean, data don't speak for themselves. I mean, they all need interpretation, and interpretation is always based on values. But I would make that point very clearly. I just was a little short in saying monitoring, and I think science as an observatory is very important. I think that was Antje just saying. They observe things that happen, and then sometimes it's surprise themselves what happened. So it's not always, you know, what sometimes social scientists think every science is a social construction. I think we have surprises, and the surprise comes by the data that we collect. And the data don't speak for themselves. That's very clear. We do have theories and so on. What we will experience surprise. And we have experienced surprise maybe with the ozone layer, when that showed very clearly that we had a real problem there. Of course, afterwards, you always find someone who had wonders, but it wasn't very clear in the science before that that could happen, and specifically in that speed and that rate of destruction. And so it was very important to have this kind of independent observatory mission of science. And I also think very often it's very clear, and I think, you know, I definitely disagree with Thatcher about, you know, all science is just providing data and all politics about providing decisions. But sometimes it's also clear that scientists overstep their boundaries by thinking they make the decisions. That's also not a good self-image of science, because, you know, in a democratic society, science is one input among others. What I think has changed, and good for change, is that we make that very strict distinction between facts and interpretation. And I think there's, you know, they're also intertwined. But at the same time, it's very important to say, you know, what is the factual base of, or what is the evidence of what we're saying? Because otherwise, you know, with all the fake news and all the other fake things that go around, we also need some institution that is basically science to tell us, well, this is, you know, absolutely certain knowledge. This is highly probable, but it's not certain. This is possible, but very unlikely. And this is absurd. And for a lot of claims, that's very important. And I've done a lot of citizen participation in my last 30 years. I mean, it's really one of my major things. And all the citizen scientists that we had, you know, there, we're asking that from scientists to say, I heard in the internet X, Y, Z. Is that true? And if you say, oh, all truth is just a social construction, they don't help them. It's very important that we make very clear that with whatever we know, there are things that are absurd. There are a lot of conspiracy theories that are just absurd. And there are things that are possible, extremely unlikely. And to give that kind of guidance in the discourse, I think is a very important element. And it's stronger maybe in some areas where we have clearly physical facts. You know, if you think about whatever thermodynamics and that there is no perpetuum mobile, regardless what you think, and that's fairly easy where you can have very good scientific guidance. There are other fields, you know, where you're set with the wicked problems where the science themselves are not clear about things, where we have contested views within the science, where we have different forms of absolutely legitimate interpretations. And that's where it's very important to have a very good discourse structure to make sure that we understand what science can contribute, but also with the limits of sciences. And I think that's very important. It's also a little bit of humility among the scientists to say, no, this is, you know, now we overstep our boundaries. They can do this. They can say, you know, if you ask me, I would do X. But they have to say, well, this is not driven by clear evidence, that there's no other conclusion than this, but this is driven also by my personal opinion, by my personal values, or by the values of those people who support me. All of that is not wrong, but it has to be extremely transparent.
Yes, Janusz, you have.
Yes, so I would like to add to this that actually we always interpret the facts in the context of existing narratives. All facts. It is not possible to consider facts in the absence of the context. It's just not possible. Human mind cannot do it. And the contexts are never neutral. So there is no neutral advice, because even if the fact could be neutral, it cannot be interpreted neutrally, in my opinion. And very important element in the scientific advice interactions between scientists and policymakers is the issue of various interests and their conflicts and confluences of interests. And from my experience, it is not possible to eliminate the context of interests, and in fact, in most of the situations, it's counterproductive to eliminate them, because I mean, let's consider this. I mean, the person who is knowledgeable about the given topic has interest in one or aspect or another, and having no interest would essentially require a person to be completely disinterested and naive about the topic, which is absurd. So it's much better for the conflicts of interest to become transparent and to balance different interests, and to balance and to see what are the different contexts, and orchestrate the process in such a way that these conflicts can be under control and to some extent balance each other. And for this reason, it's extremely important for the science advice to be interdisciplinary and to take into account many different contexts, many different stakeholders, and many different points of view. And scientists should be more aware of the narratives and of the context, because if the scientists think that, well, these are the facts and they are neutral and the fact will stay where I put it, then they are very frequently disappointed, because once the fact is delivered somewhere, there is a narrative flowing. It will take this fact, and other facts will come in and will be interpreted in some way. So scientists can only predict what is going on to happen with their facts, which way they are going to flow, and how they are going, and where they are going, how they are going to be interpreted by others, if they consider the existing narratives, if they consider the context, and if they understand what is going on. So for a policymaker to receive scientific advice, it is necessary and sufficient to have some knowledge about science, some basic knowledge about science. But for a scientific advisor to give advice, it is essential to have really deep knowledge about the politics and policy making, and understanding of the narratives and the context and what is going on.
And that is, of course, something where I must say, without being too specific, it's probably easier in that respect to be a science communicator with politicians in the situation that Antje or Ortwin have than in the one you have, Janusz, if I may say so indirectly, because then the knowledge, the sensitivities are different. And here I come to a question to you all, perhaps, which comes from the public, actually, and that I would like to frame this way. We live now in presence of a different type of political discourse than was the case 20 years ago. Let's call it a higher level of polarization. Also, the issue of these decisions brought about by algorithmic choices, and generally how to position yourself. This is the basic question. In view of a radical opposition by certain groups, if a particular type of advice or of information comes from another group that is labeled as being politically alternative. So is there a way in a more polarized digital type of science communication to really get a message across that, and we saw it in your presentation, does contain a certain amount of diversity of nuances that you always have to add to something. So how to do it? Bella, yes, please.
So in answering that, I also wanted to draw on your previous question, stroke thought, which was, and I very much liked the metaphor of the enlightenment of the invisible hand. And I just wanted to think about how science communication fits into that invisible hand, and maybe uses that invisible hand to shake the hands of others who might be across a political divide, who might, or who might be across a, kind of ideological or, just very divergent place. And I think that is the role of the science communicator. I mean, I'm a very practice-based, kind of individual. So we work every day with patients, citizens, researchers, community groups, online, in person, all of those kinds of things. And if I may extend the metaphor, I think science communication brings all of those assets into the hand that can enlighten kind of politics and science. And very much I see, it's not always, it is sometimes, I think, about persuading and kind of relying on the evidence. And, I respect everyone's opinion, but I also am a believer in evidence. But it's as much about persuading as it is about listening, and then being able to contextualize that with the body of knowledge and evidence and opinion and reaching out that is behind that invisible hand that can bring enlightenment.
Great. Yes, Antje.
Yeah, so I think as scientists, we have various tools, and you may call some even weapons that we have used in the past years that give some answers to the question raised. So one of the tools that has emerged is, of course, to be many, to demonstrate and to discuss also, or even fight with politics, that you cannot select opinions and pretend that they're all equal. And let's say that for climate change denial, we've had the awkward situation in German parliament that there were debates and hearings. And so they selected one scientist for the evidence of climate is changing and one who denies. And so they had equal speaking time. And so it was necessary that we took again a poll and showed international data. 99.9% of all scientists of all kinds do not even have an opinion, but have the facts and acknowledge the facts that climate change is real. And so to embed also the scientific knowledge into a question of quantitative measures is an opportunity, but it has to come with a warning that very often in the history of science, it all starts with one other opinion. So that is one weapon and tool and discussion that is ongoing. The other one is science activism. You started out with that. We have, again, in the whole matter of climate change and what we need for the future in risk assessments in Germany and then internationally, I think we have founded Science for Future when the kids went to the streets and demonstrated for a better future. And there was this campaign against the kids' demands. Scientists came together to write down the facts again and say, the kids are expressing their demands, but they are based on facts. And so these kinds of more again, it's a participation. It's a new way of scientists coming together, standing together, and even demonstrate together, as it happened in the US, but also in Europe, are valid tools that we use as scientifically informed, but also science-rooted citizens of Europe.
Right. Ortwin, I know that, so we only see a black wall, but that shouldn't separate so you from us. And I know you have also a specific perspective on the issue. Please. Although you're still mute. So yeah, there are ostensibly connection issue. But Janusz, yeah, you wanted to also add, perhaps we'll wait for Ortwin. Yes, please.
Yes, I can add a few words. So science is not, science is a social process, but typically it's not a democratic process. We don't really vote what is the value of the Planck's constant, and it does not change from one country to another. Of course, this is one extreme. There are many things which are decided in science in a democratic way, or in the procedure that involves consensus among the scientists and various discussions. But in general, science is not a democratic process, but the data that science produces is then fed into the democratic process, and scientific data can be used in the democratic processes, which means that people use the data and the facts in very different ways. So the same number that people can download from the internet can be interpreted in different contexts and used in different debates with different arguments. And if we agree that the democracy is the system that we want to live in, then we have to agree that the scientific data will be used in such a way, which very often means that the data is used with a different intention that it was originally produced. And I think I'm very much in favor of a situation where the data can be interpreted differently in various ways, rather than the tyranny where the author of a scientific experiment would always have the right to define how the given piece of data could be interpreted. So I think I'm very much in favor of this democratic use of the data, even if this means that sometimes people will horribly misinterpret even my own data and my own initial scientific statements. And I think this is actually an element of a healthy society, to be able for the scientific data to be scrutinized and to be looked at from various angles, and not only scientific but also ethical.
Yeah.
And this changes in time.
You know, I think there's an element also that I would like to add, perhaps, and to ask you to comment on, which is a change in our understanding of knowledge, which has been brought about by the digital transformation. And what I mean is that until so very few years ago, knowledge was an individual thing, yeah, by each scientist or each scholar. He or she has his or her knowledge specific that is usually so conveyed through a paper or through a book. You know, this analog approach to knowledge. Now knowledge is very much a social phenomenon. You know, the knowledge, who is the author of a Wikipedia article, right? It's a community. So I think we still have the difficulties you are describing are the difficulties of merging these two different axes to knowledge. Is knowledge a property of a single scientist, or is it a knowledge that is shared by a larger community? And there's still a kind of polarity there. One thing I would like to submit to you, and it's kind of confession, because I'm the only humanist among us, fortunately for you. Yeah, but I'd like to share with you a concern that is typical of the humanities in the discussion you are leading, and that is that humanities have always been there to a certain respect, to a certain extent, to question or to reject established knowledge, right? So there's, if you will, a bottom-up nature inherent in the humanities, which has led also to what Ortwin rightly actually put a question mark on. That is, you cannot say all discourses are equal. Right. And the humanities are now a little bit challenged because in many respects, they are trained to considering all discourses equal. Now I want to exaggerate it, to say that those who believe that the sun moves around the earth, rotates around the earth, are basically the representatives of the discourse, now minoritarian, as opposed to those who believe, right? So this would be the orthodox humanities approach. And that has now come under extreme challenge, of course, although so the humanists would be able to explain why this is just a philosophical approach. It has nothing to do with the actual reality, commitment to reality. And yet it is a message that has become more difficult to convey now for obvious reasons, and where enlightened humanists themselves have reservations about whether it should be conveyed at all, lest it produces the negative effects that you have concretely mentioned in terms of, right?
And by the way,
yes.
The Earth does not rotate around the sun. Both of them rotate around the center of mass of the system.
Oh, you see, but that is a very dangerous thing to say, because it might be, you see, but this is a case in point. This is a case in point. You see, it's a typical example in which a scientific reality, if it is shortened to an enormous extent, may have disadvantageous results in terms of science advice, in terms of science and politics. So it's really quite interesting to see that there is only a certain, let's say, interval of science which is likely to be conveyed and transformed into science advice, not the entirety of science, because otherwise it might in fact generate politically troublesome results. And this is something that in recent years has become more explicit than previously. Yeah. I see a question that is so a statement that I would like you to comment on, which is interpretation and then communication is the crucial part. And my question to you is, since you all smile, is, well, how to translate this into real, so positively meant science advice. Bella, since you smiled first, you'll now be on the spot.
Oh dear, I've let myself in for it, haven't I? So I should control my facial muscles more.
That's right.
No, I mean, I think, you know, I'm a science communicator, so I think, you know, and a public engagement professional, and, you know, someone who likes to bring lived experience into research. So, you know, communication is essential to all of those things. And I wondered though, and so I'm not quite sure what the question is, but I think, you know, kind of communication is essential, you know, and I think, you know, how we do that, you know, we have very many talented, you know, practical science communicators who are scientists, who are not scientists, who are intermediaries, who are, you know, kind of communities themselves, you know, and I think perhaps we also just in that need to recognize the diversity of science communicators, and as well as, you know, kind of the diversity of science, you know, so, and that there shouldn't, as long as it is, you know, kind of evidence-based, there shouldn't really be a limitation on communicators and science communication and from what constituency it comes from. So I think, you know, I think that's how I would respond to that statement. I wanted to kind of come back also perhaps to something that you were saying, Antonio, about different forms of knowledge. And, you know, certainly in the UK, you know, our research culture, especially in the health sciences, is undergoing, I think, a transition to valuing much more different types of experience and expertise around the health sciences. So very much that kind of the patient and public involvement in science is almost like a social movement. And I think that in some ways, scientists can learn from politicians in how politicians, and politics works with social movements. And, perhaps there's something in there that is for science communication scholars to unpick as well. But I'll stop there and pass over to, I think Janusz was going to say something.
No, yes, Janusz, please go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, I would like to add that actually listening is very important in the interpretation, and this is important in all the contexts, and in particular, this is what we learned as science advisors to the European Commission, that the key element of that communication is to listen to the interlocutor and to understand what the question is, and to understand what is the context of that question, where is this question coming from, and what is the purpose of the answer. Which kind of answer to that question would be useful. And usually when we start answering that what we think is the question, then it turns out that it's not, the question was actually slightly different, it needs to be rephrased. And this interaction is extremely important, that a true dialogue is the only tool that can be used to answer the real question there is, and not necessarily the first framing of the question, which may be inaccurate because of the interlocutor may have certain assumptions about what we know, what we don't know, which is not apparent in the first framing of the question. So this framing, reframing is actually a process. So like posing a question and then answering it is usually not good enough.
Antje. Yes.
Yeah, I would like to support this. I mean, we have to understand that science communication works on all levels, from the individual to the institution. And when you look at it in the last decades, we have constantly built more and more institutions to which we can make sure that science is not just a display of a very small disciplinary approach to a question, but that it is multi and inter and even transdisciplinary. We've built institutions, think IPCCs, think IPBES, so the Biodiversity Council, where politicians and scientists challenge each other together in the process. And as Janusz says, this is critical for the high-end global or European or continental or even national questions that we use the knowledge from sociology that for some types of decision-making, governance, and so on, you need institutions of trust that you build over a very long time that are really sustainable as institutions. And we need more of those. And at the same time, we all realize that through digitalization, there is this aspect where we have to reach, and especially with the young generation, for an impact of science communication, we have to respect the new channels. We have to understand that we cannot always rely on news and television or some kind of newspaper outlet, so that we constantly as societies have to understand that there are new channels to which the debate happens. Mm-hmm. And even the institutions have to realize that to have this impact they want. And so when we are clear with that, then I think we have to say, for the future that we all want, science communication and some institutions at all of those levels are really needed.
May I suggest one round also of answers to one question I would like to ask you all, and which really so moves me also from a professional point of view. And I would frame it as the institutional aspect of science advice. What I mean by that is that through science advice, there's also a competitive institutional advantage that is gained by a certain number of institutions. And let's be very open, in a market society, to the disadvantage of the competitors. So just to make an example from my own country, since we are so marginal that no one is really interested in it, I can really divulge. We happen to have a certain number of institutions, two, one particularly, that is a university at world level. Now, probably the only university in continental Europe, the ETH of Zurich, so the only institution in continental Europe that plays in the same league as the as Oxford or Cambridge. Now, there has been a certain tendency in the process of science advice in the case of COVID, but not only, on the side of the government to privilege the type of science advice that comes from this institution. To, if I may say so, the disadvantage indirectly of all other not very idiotic universities that are also so present on the Swiss arena. So how to position this? So when you provide science advice, Antje, do you do it as director of the Alfred Wegener Institute or as professor of the University of Bremen, and you, Janusz, as so professor at the University of Potsdam, and you, Bella, as vocal of the NEH Foundation Trust. So, right, the or is just for the common good without any type of institutional consideration. So,
if you ask me, I'm very aware of my different roles. I mean, sometimes I speak as a speaker for the academy. Sometimes I speak for my institution or for the whole Helmholtz Association or for all kinds of it. But I try to make the context transparent. However, because long before I became director of a large research center, I was already visible as a marine biologist who dives to the deep sea and tells fantastic tales about the unknowns of the oceans. And this view that the public has and the media have of me, luckily, they go beyond just being a manager of science. Otherwise, I would be very sad. So, in the majority of cases, what people want from me or media or sometimes also politicians is the basic, the trust in that I'm a scientist who is curious, who is based with two legs in the oceans, and who speaks on behalf of what I see, what other people can't see, because I am on and in the ocean. So that is a basis, or the ground truthing of the questions I get is very often there in my own basic research, and not so much in me as a science manager. I have come to the conclusion that even science policy have a slight distrust in the managerial types. I don't know what you think, Antonio, after your long record and career. They rather think they are talking to real scientists.
You are right, Antje. I think it's a correct assessment. Yes, fortunately for science. Janusz, how do you answer to this question?
Yes, so as I said previously, the scientist's advice is often not really a scientific advice, but just a personal comment. So one has to know of the context, and not every advising scientist is immediately a scientific advisor. On the contrary, there can be a scientific advisor who is not a scientist. And it is very important to since everybody have their interests and they have different backgrounds, it's very important to bring different perspectives together, and this includes both different backgrounds in terms of science and different scientific disciplines, and also different career paths, and the context in which the scientists do their research, but also different institutions, because there's a different cultural background in every university. So, for instance, a researcher working even on the same discipline in a technical university, in a research-intensive university, or in a different scientific institution, such as the research institute involved in applied research, they would also have different mental background, because their colleagues speak about different problems when they meet over coffee. And it is extremely important to bring in people with very different disciplines, and with all the background and the networks of interactions with different people. So I don't think that that listening to just one organization is better than listening to several organizations within the system. But I would like to make one final point. I think that science advice is very important to be done on the institutional level, because this is the only way that actually ensures the long-term trust and building of the institutional trust, and avoiding the situation when there's a scientist's advice rather than scientific advice.
Thank you. Then Bella, so if then you will have either the last or the last but one word, depending on whether we can reach so Ortwin again. Yes, I think we can. Yes.
Yeah, I'll be brief so that
yes.
and then hand over to Ortwin. So I think your points about that competitive advantage and disadvantage are well made, and they speak to a challenge for research culture, and kind of what drives scientific organizations, higher education organizations to take part in that competition. And I think this is a challenge that should be addressed to research funders, to those that create that research culture. And the only other thing that I would say is that I can see, and it comes back to the context and the situational kind of context of scientists and science organizations, that at times the motivations and the ambitions of individual scientists might be quite different to those of the organization for whom they are employed, and kind of just having that understanding can then help to situate advice and evidence.
Thank you. Ortwin, you bear the responsibility of the last words.
Well, thank you very much. I'm so sorry that I lost internet connection. So this can also happen here in a high tech environment. So my deep apology for not being there. The last word that I would like to say is, because I haven't really been able to follow the discussion, that one of the crucial resources for a good science policy interface is time. And we have just witnessed and experienced so often that both sides don't have time to really interact. And I know that's difficult because time is one of the resources that you cannot just amplify, but I think it's worth it just to keep the time, just to talk to each other without a major agenda, but just to get a better understanding of each person's horizon, each person's experience, and each person's wisdom. And I think if we had more time together, it would be much easier, rather than just having these kind of totally functional meetings in which you have 5 minutes to present your ideas and then you're out. I think that is not really good for a valuable, appropriate, and effective science policy interface.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Boetius, Professor Bujnicki, Professor Renn, and Dr. Starling, for a very enlightening discussion. I learned a lot from your wisdom, as I'm sure also our 50 more participants in this session. Thank you, and all the best for the rest of the session.